Good morning and welcome to AOD. I'm Adriana and I'll be taking you through our first PowerPoint which looks at addiction specifically. So what is addiction? It can be viewed through many different lenses, and I guess what I've found through running this particular module several times in the last few years is that it's important to unpack these different perspectives so that we can identify which perspective aligns best with the aims that we have as counsellors in terms of supporting people who are struggling with dependency. So we'll be looking at a biomedical perspective, looking at addiction through a trauma-informed lens and also through a relational perspective. I guess as counsellors we're wanting to espouse the approach that views our clients as holistically as possibly and allows us to meet them with empathic responding and compassion. So in doing that, we've got this amazing opportunity to challenge what is a dominant discourse around addiction that tends to further marginalise people with substance use dependency. And so the use of language is a really great place to begin. Language is powerful in that it creates and maintains dominant views about many things in society, including addiction. And what we found, or the research reflects, is that the current discourse and language used tends to label and disempower our clients. The media will often use terms like addict, as well as lay people in the community, and these labels can be very marginalising and degrading for people who either have a history of addiction or are trying to engage in some form of recovery. Society does tend to categorise people, and I think that that's about trying to understand who they are and meaning making. However, as counsellors, we've got to keep in mind what our core business is, and that is to meet people with empathy, unconditional positive regard, and as change agents, we're not wanting to collude with any labelling language, but rather influence a different discourse. And hopefully through the collectivisation of us using really appropriate language in our work with clients in addiction, we may actually change that discourse, and we're already seeing that happen. So what we're wanting to do with language is really separate out the person from the problem, view the person as the person and not the problem. The problem is the problem. So let's look at different types of language that we're familiar with. We have stigmatizing, labeling language in the world that tends to characterize people by their illness or condition, and this is very dehumanizing and demeaning. So in this particular client group, we're often hearing words like addict, junkie, crackhead, alcoholic. We're wanting to move away from that language. And my hope is that by the end of the module, these words will sit uncomfortably with you, that you will be moving more towards what we call person-first language. And we first saw this person-first language in mental health. It aims to destigmatize and delabel. So where once upon a time it was common to refer to a person as schizophrenic, that is no longer appropriate in the mental health field, and we talk about a person with schizophrenia, or about a client who presents with anorexia, rather than labeling the individual with a condition. So in addiction, we talk about a person with an addiction, in active addiction, in recovery. We talk about substance use dependency, and you'll see that come up in a lot of the articles you read. Someone who's substance use dependent, reliant on substances. We also talk about substance misuse, rather than substance abuse. And I think abuse has really negative connotations in our society. A lot of people with addiction histories were really offended when people talked about them abusing, because that word is more aligned with violence and aggression towards others. We also use the term drug use. So I'm hoping that I will role model this language to you well. And I don't mind you calling me out if you hear me say otherwise, because it is going against the current of the language used predominantly in community. So I'm going to invite you to view each of the following, pause the PowerPoint, and have a look at these different perspectives. I've given you some links to what we call a medical sort of perspective, which is really interesting. It tends to look at addiction as a disease that needs to be treated as such, and I guess effectively cured. We also look at a nurture perspective, and that's looking more at the impact of trauma on people's use of substances. So if you'd like to pause for a moment and have a look at those, that would be great. And when you're viewing these, I'm wanting you to really just take some notes, identifying what's resonating with you most. You don't have to be either or. I think that in terms of dialectical thinking, there can be many truths to a perspective. So there are lots of valuable information that comes out of the medical or the science perspective, but also I'm really wanting you to kind of start thinking about the relational and trauma aspects of addiction if you don't already espouse that perspective. So looking at the neuroscience of addiction, science and medicine has told us historically that addiction is a disease of the brain, and you will have seen that in the YouTube clip that I offered you. Addiction is a compulsive sort of behavior that moves us towards a rewarding stimulus, and that's where neuroscience is grounded. There's an understanding that the brain stores information about environmental cues that are strongly associated with desired substances, so that we can access that substance again. So memory helps to create what we call a conditioned response, which leads to an intense craving whenever a person encounters these environmental cues. So it's important for people in addiction to understand that biological, neurobiological processes are at play. Addiction is not an indulgence. It's far more complex than that. And it certainly isn't a sign of weakness around temperamental personality. There is chemistry that is directly related to addictive behavior, which we'll be looking at. So we need to empower our clients with psychoeducation rather than trying to shame them or blame them into change like we know some people do or some systems do. We also need to take this compassionate and less judgmental approach. So we need to be very informed as clinicians if we're going to be working in this area. So let's look at a general definition of addiction. It is any behavior that brings you temporary release, soothing, pleasure that you crave, but has long-term negative consequences, and you can't give it up despite a number of long-term negative consequences. So let's look at this from a neuroscience perspective. So the pleasure principle is a term used in neuroscience that explains the way in which the brain registers pleasure. And we don't tend to discriminate around pleasure, whether it originates in a psychoactive drug, a monetary reward, a sexual encounter, having a great dinner or a good wine. Pleasure is registered in the same way in the brain. pleasure has a distinct signature. It releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, which is a cluster of nerve cells that lies underneath the cerebral cortex. And in the next slide, I'll be showing you a map of the brain, so this will click. Dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens is connected to pleasure. So neuroscientists call this part the brain's pleasure center. All drugs, things like nicotine and caffeine and heroin cause a powerful surge in dopamine in this nucleus accumbens. And the likelihood that the use of the drug will lead to addiction is directly linked to the speed with which it promotes dopamine release. So the intensity of that release and reliability of that release tends to cause a higher level of addiction risk. So you might be taking the same drug through different methods of administration, and this can influence how likely it is that a person will become addicted. So for example, smoking a drug or injecting it intravenously as opposed to swallowing it as a pill generally produces a faster, stronger dopamine signal, and therefore it's more likely to lead to drug addiction because it's that level of dopamine rushing into the brain is at such an accelerated speed that is what causes the hook, so to speak. So let's look at this brain map. You can see the nucleus accumbens is sort of in the center. The amygdala is what regulates emotion. The hippocampus is where we store our memories and make connections. And the cerebral cortex is our thinking brain. So addictive drugs provide a shortcut to the brain's reward system by flooding this nucleus accumbens, the pleasure principal area of the brain, with dopamine. The hippocampus is what lays down those environmental cues and memories of the rapid sensation, of the satisfaction that the body experiences. And the amygdala creates a conditioned response to the stimuli. So you can see how there is an interplay between all of these complex systems or areas in the brain to actually cause addiction in a person. Let's look now at this idea of compulsion. So compulsion's fueled by intense attraction that offers great rewards, whether it's drugs, alcohol, food, sex, romantic encounters. They're fueled by dopamine in the ventral citrium, which is another part of the brain inside and under the cerebral cortex. And this part of the brain, the ventral citrium, is super important because it's charged with our pursuit of goals. When the ventral citrium sucks up dopamine, it becomes supercharged to propel you forward towards a specific goal. And to the point where everyone else becomes irrelevant in your pursuit of that goal. And for someone who has discovered the extreme pleasure of a substance, they then become driven to again pursue that pleasure that the substance gives them. A lot of areas in the prefrontal cortex are devoted to inhibition, right? So this is where your forehead is. That's your thinking brain. These systems help us regulate our impulsivity. They help us to make logical, rational decisions. However, for some people, they can experience what we call ego fatigue, where the inhibitory control parts of the prefrontal cortex, so that executive thinking brain, actually become run down. And it's like trying to hold your arm out to the side, and you can do it for 5 or 10 minutes, but you can't do it for like an hour or two. And that seems to happen to these control centers. They become very fatigued, and it's a critical aspect of addiction because you can imagine your ventral citrium is just supercharging you to move towards instant release and gratification using a drug, and the brain that's supposed to regulate that is actually fatigued and disabled. So I'm actually going to pause and begin with this slide in the second half, only because Screenomanic can only do 15 minutes at a time.